Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò, for yet another installment in our Manzoni or Manzoni Marathon that we have decided to undertake to celebrate and to promote the new translation, the new English translation of the Betrothed. How is my pronunciation going? Getting better on the Betrothed? By Michael Moore, that is here with us tonight. And this evening was born out of the desire to bring somebody, an American scholar, a scholar based in America, to talk about Manzoni today, and why is it a good idea for an American of today to read Manzoni. And the choice could only be one, and it's Andrea Ciccarelli that we have the pleasure of having here with us tonight. Andrea Ciccarelli's interest spanned from Manzoni and the 19th century novel tradition. I believe your first book, Andrea, was on Manzoni. And you find, of course, all the bibliography of Professor Ciccarelli in the website of Casa Italiana. And the last book is about pop music. So that's somehow the span of the interest of Andrea Ciccarelli. Andrea is also the Dean of the Hutton Honors College at Indiana University, and very recently started the activities of the Ragusa Foundation. Some of you might remember that next door, basically to the Casa, there used to be a bookstore, S.F. Vanni, the only Italian language bookstore in New York for a long time. And that very building is going to be the home of this new foundation that Andrea directs. So tonight we also welcome a new neighbor that is going to make 12th Street the most Italian block in New York, maybe after Park Avenue between 68 and 69, where the Consulate and the Cultural Institute are. But we're very, very happy to welcome Professor Ciccarelli to Casa Italiana for this talk on Manzoni. And we have many questions for him already, and I think he's going to answer many of them, most of them in the talk, and then we'll have time also to ask them directly. And again, it's also a way to start by welcoming him to the neighborhood and to our common mission of the promotion of the cultural dialogue between Italy and the US. Please welcome Professor Andrea Ciccarelli. Thank you.
Well, thank you, of course. If you like, I don't have to read this, and we can go to a Q&A immediately, actually. I mean, it's up to you, in the sense that, I can show just the slides. Well, first of all, thank you, Stefano Albertini, for inviting me, for having me here. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Michael Moore, for the wonderful translation, and which comes at the end of my speech, so you have to be a little bit patient, because it's kind of the cherry on the cake, in a sense. And I'm very glad that I've been asked to do this, because as a dean, I don't have much time. In fact, I haven't, let's say, I don't study anymore. Let me put it this way. This is sad, but it's true. But this really is something that excited me, because I've always been sad, because Manzoni, and I explained the title, Why Not? I should specify that this conversation, because it's a conversation, it's not really a talk or anything, it's not just by why not in the United States, or in the English-speaking world, for the matter, or abroad. But paradoxically, why not in Italy as well? Some of the reasons which made and still make Manzoni not as popular as he could or should be in Italian culture correspond probably to some of the reasons that make him unknown or very little known abroad, outside of the academic circles, and in fact, even within academia. And allow me to talk about a very personal story. When I defended my PhD dissertation, which was on Manzoni, at Columbia University in 1989, Professor Olga Ragusa was my director. At the time at Columbia, you needed to have two people from outside the department. The two people from, I don't know if things have changed, the two people from outside the department one was a linguist, of course, Manzoni, Questione della Lingua, and so on and so forth, and the other was from comparative literature, an illustrious scholar from comparative literature who had written on romanticism, mostly on British romanticism, but had written also on Leopardi and Foscolo, meaning inserted Leopardi and Foscolo in the various talks about. At the end of the defense, he was very nice. He came to me and says, this is an excellent dissertation. I really enjoyed it, blah, blah, blah. And they said, but may I ask you one thing? Why did you waste your energy on a minor author. Why didn't you write on Leopardi, on Fosca? Or maybe later on this is a professor of comparative literature, 1989, Columbia University, a distinguished professor. I mean, I don't know if Natalia was the same, but this was somebody who published 5 or 6 books. I mean, it's not at the time. This was, Wordsworth, Byron. And so I'm saying this to say that this is something we have been dealing with for a while. That brought me then to write an article years later, 20 years later actually, on the absence of our 19th century classics from the English world, in a sense. That was really on the English world. And on the presence of the English-speaking classics in Italy instead, and what was that really worked one way or the other. Well, naturally, there are also specific reasons for Manzoni's scarce presence in the international canon. For canon, of course, I intended in the possibly in the biggest, largest, broadest way you would like to imagine. Of course, not in the traditional sense. The main one definitely is tied to poor or partial translations, and therefore this problem has been solved thanks to Michael Moore's wonderful translation of his main work, of the Promessi Sposi. And we will definitely get back to the translation issues. When we read or reread, we should say, authors who are deemed to be classics, who are considered a classic, we realize how they earn the label because they still speak to us. They understand and anticipate events, themes, issues, socio-political matters, cultural innovations that will resurface in decades or hundreds of years after they die. This consideration is not so distant from Calvino's reflections about rereading famous books to rediscover a fresh and unexpected way that unlock meanings that were prevented by school memories of old prejudices. Calvino's article was published in 1981. It is indeed very hard to read a classic without falling into the trap of an established tradition set up by a generation of readers. In the room we have a scholar of Dante, at least one, and so I think all this is highly appreciated, I think. If we look at this slide here, of course we have the Manzoni scamisciato, like after the French Revolution, 1805, still close enough, is already beginning to lose faith in any of the revolutionary ideas because he has already written Il Trionfo della Libertà. Manzoni, when he writes his most rebellious work, when he's 15, not even 16 yet, because he writes it in January, February of 1801, and he was born in March of 1785, Del Trionfo della Libertà. Everybody says the Trionfo della Libertà. Manzoni is the citoyen, it's the most revolutionary work by Manzoni. But the truth is, if we read it well, we see that Manzoni is already very cautious, very, very cautious in his embracing or not actually the French Revolution ideas. Because, of course, in 1801, the Cisalpina lasts for a very short time, and so Napoleon is already showing that he's not exactly the revolutionary that people thought. But what is important about this slide, I think, is that we have these three Manzoni. This Manzoni at 50, a very young 50-year-old, we can say, that, of course, at the point is he has the cravatta, he has the tie, of course, and cravat. He's not the scamisé anymore, but he's still with kind of a romantic pose at 35, so he's looking with Lake Como behind, of course, trying to pose for Molteni, the painter who did it. This is anonymous, the first one. And then we have this 1870, when he's 85, 1870 picture in which the interesting thing in his left hand, he still has the tabacchiera that he has also in an 1841 portrait by Hayez, and that he has, and that is in the Casa del Manzoni, in his studio in Manzoni. The tabacchiera, as you know very well, is the object in which Fra Cristoforo places the bread, the leftover bread that the brother of the man he killed gives him and that he carries with him. And that he gives to Renzo when he goes to Milan. And that then the tabacchiera is misunderstood, of course, maliciously by the police, by the Spanish Milanese police, as something that was supposed to be used for terrible things, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting that in 1870, Manzoni is still very affectionate to that thing. So that's something that would merit more, but it's too complicated now. What I want to say is that what I want to do is, probably it's easier if I do this, this Manzoni here, the Descamisé, is actually very much in communion with the 1870 more embalmed Manzoni, and vice versa. And we will see that in a moment, I think, and of course. The prejudice in regards of the set minds, the minds set in a certain way in regards to classics, may be even more true when authors in question have operated during a transitional epoch, with the inevitable risk that their works might have been misunderstood, because there were people who were still before the transition, or abused for goals that differ from the original aesthetic intentions. To get to the heart of our conversation, this is exactly the case of Manzoni, I believe. Manzoni is one of those authors embalmed, mummified, in a sense, in an ambivalent role, often either the hero of Risorgimento or the author of a Catholic conservative book. Paradoxically, the two aspects that create tensions within Manzoni's poetics and life, his Catholicism and his loyal support for the Italian unification, are the culprits of his controversial role as a classic of European literature. His Catholic faith marks him as a conservative and a traditionalist, devoted to the Church of Rome, which is, of course, quite the opposite if we look at what happened in the 19th century. This is a slide of Davide Albertario, who was a Jesuit and who wrote the eulogy on the Osservatorio Cattolico for Manzoni in 1873 when he died. And the eulogy, as you can see, is not very, very positive. Don Ferrante sapeva dire no a Donna Prassede. Manzoni disse troppi sì alla signora Rivoluzione. Don Ferrante, that is one of the worst, Catherine said one of the worst in terms of, no, actually it's fun, but somebody who really doesn't have any, he was even better than Manzoni because he could say no to his wife once in a while. Manzoni cannot say no to Lady Revolution. So in 1821, another Jesuit, Giuseppe Salvagnoli Marchetti, friend of Monaldo Leopardi, father of Giacomo, wrote a dreadful, a vitriolic review of the Inni Sacri by Manzoni, because he thought that Manzoni was using language which was too popular, which is exactly what Manzoni wanted to do. So at a certain point he says that la Madonna è greve. We don't say that, non diciamo più quello nemmeno per le bestie. We don't say even for the bestie. Which is, and then he says he depicts Jesus as the resurrection of Jesus as a drunken guy, which is exactly what Manzoni wanted, because of course he wanted to capture the attention of people who were not specialists and so who were not educated. So the Jesuits have had a long history of being negative in regards to Manzoni. In 2015, I just was reading, I ran into it when I was preparing this talk. In 2015, another Jesuit, whose name is Francesco, that is Pope Francis, actually clearly has changed, Jesuits have changed their mind, because he was blessing some people who were getting married in St. Peter. And he told them, a book that you should read is Promessi, sposi, because it's a good book to go through the difficulties of life. So maybe things are changing in the Catholic Church in regards to Manzoni. But of course, all this is to say that there are these prejudices and these ideas that make us place a classic wherever we want it, according to our own ideas, tastes, ideology, prejudices, and so on and so forth. At the same time, Manzoni believed in Italian unification, but he supported the Piemontese government, of course. So he was his role as a hero of Risorgimento was downplayed by many, because Manzoni, who was a Republican, not in the sense of the party, but in the sense for the Republic and not for the monarchy, a Republican, of course, changed his mind for pragmatical reasons, because otherwise Italy wouldn't have been unified. But this was also something that was used against him. The conflicts that we have between the Vatican State and the newly formed Italian government after 1861 and then after 1870 when Rome falls, were soon enough resolved in a common vision of a unified but Catholic Italy and favored the creation of cultural models that could serve the goals of both states, the Vatican and Italy. Manzoni was a perfectly dual specimen. The Church, despite the strong initial opposition to his political choices and to open-air confessions of the clergy's flaw, adopted his poem, I'm referring of course to Don Abbondio, adopted his poems and the novel in the seminaries by the late 1800s, 1888, 1892 is the first time in which Manzoni appears in the anthologies in the seminary. I confess that one of these anthologies is written by a guy named Andrea Ciccarelli. So it is. He was, whatever it is, uncle of my father, a priest, a Monsignor. But, you see, he put Manzoni in the anthology. At the same time, the post-unified Italian government had no choice but to see him as a symbol of cultural unity, especially because of his activism, even in the very late years of his life. In 1871, the 86-year-old Manzoni, so 1 year after that picture that we saw before was taken, the 86-year-old Manzoni just accepted the honorary citizen of Rome, upsetting the Vatican diplomacy. The Osservatore Cattolico, the newspaper of the Vatican, wrote against this event. But he still felt the fire in the belly to write a rebuttal to an article originally published in 1866 in France and reprinted in 1871 by the Corriere Milanese by Adolphe Thiers, who was no other but the president of the Third French Republic in the moment. This article was finished and sent, but never published, by the Corriere Milanese, probably for diplomatic reasons, of course. They didn't want to have another war with France. Thiers has stated that Italy's road to unification was laborious, filled with bumps, but finally successful. Manzoni's rebuttal insisted that it was much smoother than it seemed, and would have been even smoother if powerful foes had not interfered. This was a not-so-hidden reference to France's 1866 intervention against Garibaldi's troops in Mentana, of course, an allusion that hit the nail on the head even more, as in 1866, Adolphe Thiers was indeed the Prime Minister of France who ordered the French deployment to aid the Vatican State. No wonder that Garibaldi, Cavour, and Victor Emmanuel visited the elderly writer in different occasions, obviously. So, it is rather logical, given the historical context after the unification, that Manzoni's political and Christian novel, in quotation mark, could be seen as a model for mediation and moderation from both sides, the Vatican and Italy, rather than for its humoristic complexity, as Pirandello and Gadda teach us. And this is the true watershed in Manzoni's scholarship. We could say that if the passage from the tragic genre, I'm referring to the Adelchi, the last tragedy that he writes, when he begins writing the novel, of course, to the humorism of the novel is the reason of his fame, it is also the reason, in a sense, of his demise. This was true in the 19th century as well. Niccolò Tommaseo said that Manzoni made a mistake to write the novel because Niccolò Tommaseo read the novel as a realistic novel and therefore didn't like it because of the portrayal of the church. D'Azeglio liked the novel because of the portrayal of the church. So it was a debate that started much sooner. And it is still the key to the dilemma today, as the novel's elliptical styles gets lost almost entirely outside of a humoristic interpretation. When I talk about elliptical styles, of course, I refer to the fact that Manzoni says many things, like all the great authors, that doesn't write, really. We have to interpret them. Now, of course, we know Fermo e Lucia, the first novel that he writes, the first draft of the Promessi Sposi, the first novel, according to the scholars, is much more graphic. So Don Rodrigo physically attacks Lucia, for instance, in Fermo Lucia, grabs Lucia. So it gives us this idea Don Rodrigo wants to rape Lucia. Of course, we know that Don Rodrigo wants to rape Lucia also in the Promessi Sposi. We are not stupid, right? We don't need that. And so, but the Promessi Sposi are definitely more elliptical, and there are two things that usually are missing. One thing that usually is missing, eroticism. This is the accusation, for instance, Alberto Moravia. The other is that there is too much providence, that is the divine providence, and we'll get to that in a moment. I beg to differ about certain things, because if we read the book in a humoristic sense, and I mean in the Pirandellian sense, we know Pirandello uses Manzoni, together with Dostoevsky and other authors, to explain his theory on humor, right? Il sentimento del contrario, the feeling of the incongruous. Pirandello warns us that we don't have to read, everything that Don Abbondio does needs to be reversed. Okay, so this is when Don Abbondio when the Bravi wait for Don Abbondio, and of course you have the wonderful translation here, that you can see it, right? I'm not covering. But I read in Italian because I don't want to sound ridiculous. And of course Don Abbondio, lor signori sono uomini di mondo e sanno benissimo come vanno queste faccende, il povero curato non c'entra, fanno i loro pasticci fra loro e poi vengono da noi come se andrebbe a un banco a riscuotere. Fanno i loro pasticci, they make a mess. If we pick up the dictionary of 19th century Italian dictionary, Fanfani, the Tommaseo Bellini 1866, and so on and so forth, one of the figurative meanings, in fact the first one in Tommaseo Bellini, of combinare pasticci, fare pasticci, it means to get somebody pregnant. So, Don Abbondio is saying, basically, they want him to, this guy needs to be born, he needs to be born settemino, as they used to say, no? And so you see, there is no sex in the Promessi Sposi, but actually there is sex if we read well in a humoristic way, the novel. And this is exactly, and also it gives us immediately the pettiness, the cowardliness of Don Abbondio, who immediately gives us and tells us that they must have done something wrong, and that's why. At the same time, he also tells us that this was something that happens all the time. So Manzoni was not so prudish or ignorant, after all. Okay? So all these things that we can think just from this little passage that we read. So this is an example of how, if we don't read the novel according to a humoristic style, humoristic style, we really miss why Manzoni writes the Promessi Sposi, in a sense. So, is Manzoni a modern classic whose vision breaks the barrier of time, or is he dated, given his Catholic views and his association to political events that are fulfilled and gone, although, of course, Italy is unified more or less, as we know, and the Lega was there. We are not so there. I would like to reply with a quote from a humoristic writer, Ennio Flaiano, who cannot be accused of being Catholic, of course. And here, and this is the translation is not from Michael Moore, you will see right away it's mine, so it's very pedantic and pedestrian. Ma ci rendiamo conto che i Promessi Sposi sono la storia italiana fissata per sempre, la sua tipologia eterna, una specie di calendario perpetuo, lo zodiaco con i suoi segni inevitabili? Ci saranno sempre da noi due che non possono sposarsi o restare amici, perché ci si mette di mezzo l'apparato pubblico italiano con i suoi burocrati, le sue squadracce, la miseria, la peste, la guerra, l'ipocrisia, la paura, il disordine. Manzoni ci abbraccia tutti, i suoi detrattori compresi, e ci spiega a noi stessi. And of course, we are talking about Manzoni, not Flaiano, but of course, Flaiano is another one who I think is a classic, because this was written in 1951, 1952, and he could have written this morning, right? Unfortunately, in a sense. But the modernity of certain things, of course, restare amici, for two people who restare amici, we know that Flaiano. So this is really, of course, now we don't have a problem. They're talking about gay marriages or something like that, or people who live together without being married, but without even going think that these were gay marriages. Two people who wanted to live together, which happened to Flaiano, in fact. In Italy, in 1950, they were being ostracized, because they weren't married. So, you see the modernity that we have here, but not to mention the peste, the pandemic, the war that we have, unfortunately, le squadracce, and of course, we don't want to think about the government in Italy right now, because the squadracce, of course, is the squadracce fasciste, but we hope that doesn't happen again. But again, there is an author who understands the modernity of Manzoni, because even if he puts things that Manzoni couldn't have thought or didn't want to think, I don't know that Manzoni would have approved gay marriages, let me put it this way. Let's not exaggerate here. But Manzoni is like Shakespeare or any other classics. It really talks to us and gives us the opportunity to build up on whatever he has written or has suggested. And this is really the role of a classic. I was going to say it in English, but I'd rather say in Italian. The promessi sposi, because I can't pronounce that name as well. I didn't put it here. This is Flaiano, but the Betrothed, whatever. No different than almost all his other works, are the product of an author who, since his early writings, never looked for an easy solution, testing the waters for possible rational answers that would make sense of the irrational shadows of history. This rational search would end up with a reaction to history's illogical inequity through the paradox of the Catholic faith, that is, he adopted a non-rational system, par excellence, to unravel an irrational matter. Okay, we are in a city filled with psychiatrists and whatever, so we can understand this sentence, but basically this is what Manzoni does, in a sense. Manzoni always believed, since he was young, that we live in an upside-down world dominated by injustice. This reverse space can make sense, in Manzoni's mind, only through faith, something that remains deeply personal and intimate, and that never becomes a tangible, realistic, and social transformation. And in fact, one of the things that Albertario, the priest, the Jesuit we talked about before, laments in his articles, he writes several articles against Manzoni. Albertario is that it is clear that Manzoni doesn't believe in the divine providence, because if you read well what the novel says, so the truth is Albertario was a good scholar, without knowing. The problem is he wanted Manzoni to write what he would like, rather than just analyzing Manzoni. And we will go that in a moment. To the contrary, religion, from an objective standpoint, is the sign of a defeat, or the defeat of reason. Let's not forget that Manzoni is the nephew, is the grandchild of Cesare Beccaria, of course. The defeat of reason, it is the awareness of the anthropological impossibility of a true change, of the possibility to really renew human reality beyond the personal sphere. If we look at the ending of the Adelchi, 1822, of course, the mortally wounded Lombard prince tells to his unrepentant father, Desiderio, that life is a gran segreto, a secret that we may understand only on the verge of dying. Gran segreto è la vita, e non comprende che l'ora estremo. Questo felice is Charles Mann, who is there witnessing, so Charles Mann is there standing. Questo felice, cui la mia morte fa più fermo il soglio, cui tutto arride, tutto plaude e serve, questo è un uomo che morrà. The secret of life is simple. Life is an exorcism of death. Even mighty Charles Mann, questo felice, is destined to death. Hence, the necessity to ponder on the difference between acting and experiences, making, committing, doing an action and undergoing it. This secret, after all, is not so different from the sugo di tutta la storia at the end of the novel. And you have it there. We don't need to read it. The moral of the story is that if there is a further explanation, a further meaning to the male di vivere, if there is a providential design, this design escapes us, is impenetrable. It needs to be accepted for what it is, without questioning it, or worse, making the mistake to interpret it, to individualize it, as Renzo or Don Abbondio often do. Renzo, pontificating here between Agnese and Lucia, and this is Don Abbondio. This slide is the illustration that Manzoni placed in the spot when Don Abbondio is thanking God in the 1840 edition. The 1840 edition is a graphic novel, if you like, because it's an illustrated book. But Manzoni really, we know from Gonin, the illustrator, in a letter to Manzoni's stepson, Manzoni's stepson thought that his stepfather had nothing to do, Stefano Stampa, had nothing to do with the illustration. Clearly, in this letter, it shows that. Gonin, the illustrator who died only a few years after Manzoni, Manzoni had just died when all this happened, Gonin replied that that's absolutely not true. Your stepfather asked me to redo many illustrations, to completely redo an illustration, and above all, he changed the place of the illustration in the book because he wanted the illustration to really be significant in regards to the story. So Manzoni has published, in a sense, if you like, almost a graphic novel in that sense. But this is the moment in which Don Abbondio discovers that Don Rodrigo is actually dead. And what does he do? He thanks God for having sent the peste to free the world from people like Don Rodrigo, stating, vedete se la provvidenza arriva alla fine, figlioli, and so on and so forth. The blasphemous priest, because he's blasphemous, of course, and of course, Don Albertario wouldn't like me to say this, but that's why the church didn't like Manzoni in this regard. The blasphemous priest, cheering like a sport fan after the scoring of his team. Look at him. He's like, thank God, thank you. It looks like, I don't know what games there was today in the World Cup, but Italy is not playing anyhow, the United States are. But, cheering like a sport fan after the scoring of his team is really the answer of what this illustration is really the answer of what Manzoni means for providential view. Providence is not for personal consumption or interpretation. If we insist for a moment in this parallel between Adelchi and the novel, we see how the tragic tones concede to humor, spreading the same pessimism, but with a smile. Adelchi is a powerful prince and a warrior whose actions weigh heavily on the heads of those who are crushed by the wheels of history. His resignation reflects his torment between action and inaction in a world that he contributed very heavily to keep upside down. So it is no surprise that he recommends to his father, Desiderio, to envision his incarceration as not as a defeat, but as a victory. Godi che re non sei, godi che chiusa l'oprarti ogni via, loqua gentile ad innocente opera non v'è, non resta che far torto o patirlo. Una feroce forza il mondo possiede e fa nomarsi dritto. Fa nomarsi, that is, jurisprudence is forcing people to call jurisprudence in the way, diritto, but actually it's fa nomarsi as the arrogance of pretending to be jurisprudence, in other words. So there is no place on earth you can only do either wrongdoing or you can undergo wrongdoing. Una feroce forza il mondo possiede, fa nomarsi dritto, and so on and so forth. This feroce forza, some scholars call these lines the death of Rousseau in Italian culture, at least for the 19th century, of the dream of believing in the ability to reverse once and for all our upside-down world. But of course, these lines come straight, of course, if we know Foscolo had written a wonderful essay in 1808, one of the orazioni that Foscolo writes when he's supposed to be visiting professor at the University of Pavia, and he's paid for the entire year, and he teaches only 2 classes. Of course, only Foscolo was able to pull these things out. And he teaches these 2 classes. The one is, of course, l'orazione inaugurale on the ufficio della letteratura, and the second one is dei limiti della giustizia. And Foscolo talks very much about this, taking it from Vico, of course, Hobbes, Machiavelli, and so on and so forth. So this is not just Manzoni, obviously, but it's important that Manzoni espouses this aspect. And of course, this is Adelchi speaking, not necessarily Manzoni. The passage from tragedy to novel, from tragic to humorism, seems to be one of the main causes of the incomprehension as regards to Manzoni's poetics. The ferocious strength mentioned by Adelchi does not leave any doubts about his merciless and chaotic dispensation. The same brutal strength is mentioned by Don Abbondio when pleading with Renzo after he reveals Don Rodrigo's plot against the wedding. Renzo, non si scherza, qui non si tratta di torto o ragione, si tratta di forza. Don Abbondio is right. We see a demonstration of this force, of this brute power, in fact, during the banquet in Don Rodrigo's house, when Fra Cristoforo naively tries to plead for justice in regards to Lucia. All the people in the 5th chapter, all the people who should have and could have redressed the wrong committed by Don Rodrigo are sitting at this table. So this is, of course, in other words, Don Abbondio, like Adelchi, tells a truth. Adelchi is a tragic figure. He's dying, he's a prince, and he's somebody who is self-conscious. So what he does, so when we read that, we have a sense of, we feel bad. When we read Don Abbondio telling Renzo, qui non si tratta di torto ragione, si tratta di forza, of course, we understand what it means, but we also laugh because of the ironic and humoristic style. And this aspect, paradoxically, this mitigation, the mitigation of irony and humor, embodied in this sense by the cowardly but humanly weak Don Abbondio, may give the impression that we shouldn't take it too seriously. And that gives this idea that basically Manzoni uses comic and it's a benevolent, it's kind of a benevolent comic view of life, in other words. If we go ahead and we understand, this is actually, if we talk for a moment still about Don Abbondio, after he meets the Bravi, he goes to bed, he feels bad, of course, and he has a nightmare. And during the nightmare, what does he dream? We don't see anything yet, we just read this. Bravi, Don Rodrigo, Renzo, Viottole, Rupi, fughe, inseguimenti, grida schioppettate. There is also Renzo, not just the Bravi. Don Abbondio has not seen Renzo yet. We haven't met Renzo yet in the novel. The narrator has not introduced Lorenzo Tramaglino. But in the vignetta, in the illustration that accompanies the lines that we just read, Renzo is on top of Don Abbondio, stabbing Renzo. And we know that Renzo will threaten Don Abbondio at the end of the chapter, putting his hand on the dagger that he's carrying with him, and threatening Don Abbondio to harm him if he doesn't tell him the truth. So this is an anticipation of what will happen, because, of course, again, Manzoni, you see, the humoristic character, we have to interpret it in a reverse way. And so even Renzo, as we know very well from the description that Manzoni gives us, even Renzo può avere, come dice Manzoni, con una certa aria di festa e nello stesso di braveria, comune allora anche agli uomini più quieti, col suo pugnale dal manico bello. So, this is the way we should read the Promessi Sposi. Promessi Sposi are a wonderful book because they actually don't speak completely well about anyone, and completely bad about anyone, except, Don Rodrigo, of course. But when he dies, who knows, and so on and so forth. But nobody believes about that, obviously. And this is exactly why I believe that the humoristic lecture reading is probably the best way to go ahead. Obviously, again, if we look only at the comic aspect, or if we look only at the more naturalistic, realistic aspect, the pest, all those descriptions, then if we isolate them, those things can become rather boring, or rather, okay, people have already done that, obvious. And so, of course, here we go to the translation issue, and here we go to the translation issue, and we get to the issue of translation. The main issue until recently, with few exceptions, has been that most 19th century translations and many 20th century translations follow the 1827 text. Not that it's a bad novel, but it's not the Quarantana. It's not the definite edition that he published in 1840. And many, if not most of them, miss to find a balance in rendering Manzoni style without watering it down to a pseudo-naturalism or making his humor exaggeratedly comic. Here, let me just open a parenthesis, though, not with an English translation. I'm getting there. But with the first official French translation, there was a pirate translation, a French translation in 1827, which actually sold out immediately. But this is the first official translation that Manzoni, commissioned in 1828. And here it is. And in the first official translation in 1828, published by Charpentier, by Ray de Sueur, this translation was a very fortunate edition. There's so many reprints throughout the century. 16 reprints before 1880 and 19 before 1890. Then I couldn't find anything after that. But still, 16 reprints between 1828 and 1880. Unfortunately, all these reprints are based on the 1827 text, not on the Quarantana. They never went back and updated. The other unfortunate thing is that the translator didn't understand Italian as well as he thought he did. And so he didn't get Manzoni's irony. And so he actually mistranslates completely certain passages, rendering funny passages or ironic passages or humoristic passages as a kind of naturalistic passages that, of course, when you get to the 1860s, 1870s, well, okay, if I have to read a naturalistic novel, I read Zola. Why do I have to read Manzoni? Obviously, if I'm in France. And so what I'm trying to say is that all these reprints are actually, at the same time, very good. They were very good for Manzoni's in terms of, and for the translator, of course, and the publisher, but they were not good for Manzoni's fame in 19th century France, and therefore in 20th century. Because I never heard of an 1840 author who is discovering in 2020, meaning we think that author is a classic because we have many translations, good translation, we read it if it comes from a different culture and so on and so forth. So this is what happened is that, now the French intellectual, of course, read Manzoni directly in Italian, so they didn't have this problem, but I'm talking about the broader public. This happened very much, of course, as we also for the English translation. The first translation, probably the worst translation that we have on Manzoni, by far, is by Charles Swan, poor guy, I mean, who was a Lutheran, English Lutheran, a Lutheran pastor, very young, he was 27, 28, a Lutheran pastor who lived in Pisa, who was working, he was a chaplain for the British Navy. And he translates Manzoni, but first of all, he doesn't understand many things. He doesn't understand Manzoni irony. You remember that Manzoni paraphrasing Voltaire calls Shakespeare un barbaro non privo di ingegno. And he writes him a letter insulting him because he insulted Shakespeare, of course. So, and this Manzoni says, no, actually, this is not what I meant. So Manzoni must have thought, oh my God, this guy is translating me. Oops, we need the divine providence here. But in any case, so Charles Swan, first of all, doesn't translate the introduction because this is useless. We don't need it. So this is the advertisement that he writes to say that he doesn't need to translate the introduction. Of course, the introduction, there is in Nusha everything which will happen in the story. You can read everything which happens in the story, in the plot. How do you know that? You don't know it when you read it, but when you reread it, of course, you know it. And so if you read the book twice because you have to study it, then when you read the introduction, you can't be without the introduction. So he takes the introduction out. So the English publisher, of course, who reads this translation doesn't understand what's going on, what is this fake thing or the fake manuscript, what is going on. The second thing is that he doesn't really understand many of the passages. And the third most important thing is that he takes out everything which he thinks is too Catholic. So for instance, this will be in the recording, of course. Everything which is too Catholic. So for instance, all the passages about Federico Borromeo. Because, of course, Cardinal Federico Borromeo is a little bit too much for the young Lutheran pastor, okay? And so he takes that. So what happens to Don Abbondio in front of Borromeo, all those things which are crucial for the story, you, of course, you read it, no, and at some point it looks like, okay, I'm jumping here from one place to another. So obviously, it was a disastrous translation, and in fact, the reviews of this translation in England were all negative, but not because they were negative about the translators. They didn't know better. They were negative about Manzoni, say, okay, Manzoni is a good tragedy author, but he's really a terrible novelist. Okay? Literally. I mean, who would know this better than I do. Literally, like, I mean, why do we want to waste our time reading Manzoni? Okay? Of course, there were exceptions. The exceptions were, for instance, Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley wanted to translate Manzoni because she thought, and we read together, that it is so entirely Italian in all its parts that it can only be truly relished in its native guise. Manzoni has not only the deepest knowledge of human heart, but a vivid graphic talent surpassing that of any modern tale writer. Unfortunately, the publisher to whom Shelley proposed to the translation said no. It would have been a very different story, I believe, in England for Manzoni if Mary Shelley had the opportunity to translate and not Charles I. And this is really one of those moments of history which things happen a little bit, disaster. Well, and then, of course, and Mary Shelley, of course, despised Manzoni from a biographical point of view because being a good revolutionary and Puritan, because only England can be revolutionary and Puritan at the same time, especially in the 19th century. She was mad because Manzoni, this is in the 1830s, was not doing anything, was not writing anymore. He had to write another political book because she, of course, thought Promessi, Sposi were a great political book. Independence of Italy was important and against the Austrian Empire and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, she maintained throughout her life a strong admiration for the writer. Then there was another translation that in 1844, published in London by an anonymous, who understood the text so well that you can see, this is the famous sentence at the end of the introduction about the libri d'avanzo. It's better to publish a book at the time, because one at a time is even too many. And he thought Manzoni was referring when there is no profit in advance. Of course, the real translation is here in Mago's translation, if not too much. So you can imagine this translation is the first translation on the Quarantana. So finally, we have the Quarantana, the 1840 edition translated, but it's translated in this way. And so plenty of mistakes, plenty of misunderstanding. So Manzoni has really a bad history in English in the 19th century. And finally, let's come to the United States. We're getting close. I'm also close to finish. Finally, let's come to the United States. And of course, one of the most famous reviews in the 19th century, or in general, of Manzoni, is the one by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's really about, again, a translation of somebody whose name, to me, is unpronounceable, George William Featherstone Hough, I think, because it's Featherstone, H-A-U-G-H at the end, which I don't know how to pronounce, but Featherstone, let's cut it short, who was a geologist, a British geologist working in the United States, and translates Manzoni when he is in the United States, but published it in England on the Metropolitan, a journal in London, in episodes. And he actually doesn't do a terrible job in terms, he doesn't miss anything, but what this is probably, and he uses the 27 edition because we are in 1834, but the problem is that he doesn't know how, so he uses Latin or Old English to translate, or Middle English at the most, to translate the more high passage. So when Federico Borromeo speaks, he speaks in high English, in Old English, like Chaucer. So imagine you are an American picking up in 1834 a translation of an Italian, and why is this Italian novelist trying to remake Chaucer? Once again, a useless translation, even if at least it was faithful, I mean, in the sense to what it was. And so again, a useless translation because there were issues like this. And Poe, in fact, jokes very much about this. The style is, for the most part, Italian, in English words, but Italian still. This is a very important point. Edgar Allan Poe really touches two very important points that comes to us, to our day. Here is something that we stick to the ribs. a work of which we will try to give a sort of outline, but it cannot be abridged. The machinery of the story is not intricate, but each part is necessary to the rest. To leave anything out is to tell nothing. Of course, this is exactly the point. He knew the translation were either mutilating the text, and therefore you don't have the promessi sposi, or they were not really trying to write in standard, for the time, American or English or British English, which is exactly what the problem is with the translations of Manzoni's books, in French or in English for the 19th century. And from here, of course, we finally made it. From here, of course, we come directly to our days, to Michael's translation. Of course, already in don't believe that the 20th century translation were actually on the Quarantana, because already in 1972, Penman, who translated for the Penguin books, Manzoni, wrote an article that then became the introduction to his book, proving how many translations that claim to be, even the Harvard Library, for example, Harvard Library Classics, whatever, was supposed to be on the Quarantana. Instead, he proved that it was on the Ventisettana, on the 1827 edition, because there are certain things that are translated literally from there that do not appear in the 1840 edition. So the tradition began with the wrong foot, and it really took a very, very long time to stop, rather than keep trying to correct while you're running your gait, to stop and to really start with the right foot, the translation, really. And let me say a few words about Michael Moore's translation. Michael Moore's work, in my view, is superb because Moore really makes an effort to do what Edgar Allan Poe suggested, respecting the original without rewriting in Italian, but translating the Italian into American, into standard American, and making the subtlety and nuances of the original form disappear into the new language. He explains all this very clearly in his dense and poignant introduction. Moore is not afraid every time a literal reading would result into a pedantic or less exciting and dignifying style to move away from the littera. Because this is the issue. Michael Moore knows that for an apparently simple but in reality complex books like The Betrothed, it is crucial to offer a language that speaks to all, not only because that is what Manzoni has done and wanted and will want, but because it is the only a fair way to repropose a classic. This is the only way to present a translation that does not smell or sound like a translation, precisely, but that becomes a book that can still talk today to different cultures, languages, and different publics. I am convinced, as June Palahiri states in her marvelous preface, that the English-speaking world can finally appreciate Manzoni's polyphonic, novel, and multifaceted style in its entirety. In other words, to go back to my initial assertion, to appreciate Manzoni, finally, as a full-fledged classic who fully belongs to the international canon. And I wanted to finish here, but I had the 2 lines. In conclusion, I could easily point a finger, like Fra Cristoforo to Don Rodrigo, toward the indirectly guilty party here, Michael Moore, whose wonderful translation just came out, as we know, in 2022. What is Michael Moore's fault? That he was not born in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for a brilliant overview of Manzoni's fortune and misfortunes in the literary world and the political world. And I think if we have questions, will you? Yeah. Of course, Mike.
Yes. I mean, first, thank you. I appreciate so much.
Aspetta, Michael, che la registriamo.
Sì, sì.
Michael, scusa, vieni qua.
Avanti.
You probably have more than one question.
Oh, this is really anything, no question. This is supposed to be a conversation, really. That's why.
Yeah. First, thank you. I mean, I've really learned a lot from your talk, since the research I was doing into the novel was primarily into style, and I sort of resisted, this huge bibliography of critical works dedicated to Manzoni, because then I knew I would never finish. I was struck by many of the things that you said, not so much about the history of the translation, which I did consult earlier translations, 20th century, but about your remarks about divine providence, which, I always saw was kind of a cage for Manzoni, and the Italians put him in, and I find so little evidence of that. And your historical evidence, contextual evidence is quite striking, because just at the linguistic level, he uses the word providence maybe 4 times.
With the capital P. In fact, this is very important. Sorry if I interrupt you. Yeah. In fact, Don Abbondio uses the capital P, that is the providence, God, because he's a priest. He knows what he's talking about, which is even more blasphemous. When Renzo uses providence, alla provvidenza, let's fortune, whatever fortune, he uses with the small P.
I think the most striking thing for me in terms of just doing a word count type of thing, concordanza that they used to do, is his frequent use of the word confuso, which I had to translate in many different ways, depending upon the context. But it seemed to be a real obsession with him. Somehow, I liked what you said about explaining the unreasonable through the reasonable, through the rational, but very much his trying to make sense of things or to steer a path through a world of confusion. I just saw him as a man sort of terrified of what he saw in the French Revolution, and it's hard to say where he even stood on revolution,
That is absolutely a great comment. Speaking of the revolution, there is one aspect. When I turn this off now, of course, now I can go back, but the famous picture of 1805, 1835, and 1870, well, Manzoni is the only Italian intellectual of his generation that in the 1850s does not justify Robespierre, of course, but doesn't treat him like the monster he is. In fact, he writes in the essay, in the parallel between the American Revolution and the French Revolution that he writes in the 1850s, he actually says Manzoni is so balanced and he's still that he contextualizes Robespierre in his moment. So he says Robespierre was not bloodthirsty, literally. That's what he says in Italian. Robespierre was not a bloodthirsty person. He was stupid in a sense. He was crazy. He believed in that system that then, but he actually contextualized. Leopardi didn't do that. Foscolo didn't do that. Leopardi and Foscolo speak very badly about Robespierre. I mean, in the sense, just to give 2 examples of the other 2, obviously, of the Ottocento. Certainly Carducci doesn't do that, but of course Carducci was not, a little bit superficial here and there. But in the sense, and so this is to say how, when we talk about a humoristic view of life, a view of life which is really, it really makes me think about what when Pirandello wrote on his tomb, and it was his epitaph that he wrote for himself. La vita è una triste buffoneria. I mean, it's triste buffoneria. I mean, is it funny or is it sad? They can't. And so I really believe that within the limits of the Manzoni's culture, Catholicism, and, Manzoni is a 19th century person. He was born in 1785. And so, but nonetheless, Manzoni is really in the line of humor. It is not a coincidence that Pirandello, Gadda, Svevo, Calvino, Flaiano, just to mention a few, like Manzoni and consider Manzoni a great author. Who doesn't like Manzoni? Of course, and they don't have to. The more naturalistic writers, because there is this misunderstanding of how to read that. And then at that point, it's okay, it's boring, there is no sex, and who cares about the church? It becomes like Sunday school.
And my second question, it does regard religion. When I've been presenting the book at different venues, I'm always asked what was the most difficult part, and my answer is immediately Borromeo, because I think that is the one kind of unexplainable part to me. First of all, that there is where he is no longer humorous, and that there is no ironic distance between the language that he uses. I've always wondered whether he's just quoting Borromeo or what is happening there.
He does quote large passages from Borromeo's works or from Borromeo's biographer, who is also the historian of the Black Plague. So there he's using that. But there is, well, first of all, there are two moments about Borromeo, that one is when Borromeo is present, one when Borromeo is not present, which are extremely interesting and tell us that Manzoni knows that Borromeo wasn't perfect. One is when Manzoni says, tuttavia, that is, alas, Borromeo made the decision to do the procession, and the next day the Black Plague was spread throughout Milan. So that means that tuttavia, that alas, nonetheless, even if Borromeo knew that this would be insisted, he gave up. And so that's a moment in which we see that there is very little humor there, because we're talking about the past. And so we go back to Adelchi, we go back to a tragic moment of life. But the other, which instead is completely humoristic, is when, at the very end, the last chapter, when Don Abbondio, happy because Don Rodrigo is dead, happy because the heir of Don Rodrigo is such a nice guy that invites everybody to dinner for the wedding. He pays the wedding of Renzo and Lucia, and he buys their property, and he doubles the amount that Don Abbondio asks for, and probably Don Abbondio had already asked too much in any case, knowing Don Abbondio, if we understand how Don Abbondio worked. And so all these together that we see, and at a certain point, Don Abbondio, he tells Renzo and Lucia, oh, you're lucky because you have all life in front of you, and they say, oh, but you too, oh, I got to the 11:45 p.m. Now, of course, that's a parody of an evangelical passage. Lo sposo è vicino, la mezzanotte è vicina, lo sposo arriva, and so on and so forth. That is, la mezzanotte è vicina, this is not the mezzanotte in terms of the Gethsemane garden, but is the resurrection. So it's one of the most important moments if you are a priest, if you believe the theology, or that you're Don Abbondio is not an ignoramus, and therefore he knows his stuff, and he says, la mezzanotte, sono arrivate alle 11:15, which is of course a blasphemous moment, terribly blasphemous moment, but he's quoting Borromeo, because Borromeo, when he preaches to Don Abbondio, quotes that passage, and he says, when Don Abbondio begins crying, because he says, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it, I regret it, and so on and so forth, and Borromeo, come here, my friend, I don't want it, and he hugs him, when he's doing that very fraternal, nice thing, with the commotion and everything, he says, la mezzanotte vicina, noi because he says we have a certain age, besides it's the Black Plague, we may die anyhow, so la mezzanotte è vicina, lo sposo sta arrivando, la mezzanotte è vicina. And at the end, we have Don Abbondio, who is the winner from terms of Darwinistically speaking, is the winner of the Nobel, of course, Instinct of Survival, obviously. Don Abbondio, who teases, so he didn't even learn anything from that. That, as a reverse, of course, sentiment to the contrary, is also tells us that Manzoni tells us that Borromeo, of course, was a good guy, but sometimes he didn't understand how to read people.
There is, I think one of the few redeeming moments for Don Abbondio is when, he's really getting chewed out, by Borromeo, and he's thinking, then he becomes human in a way. Not that his defects made him less human, but when he says, well, it's easier for you to say, he's thinking this, not saying this, you weren't facing those two bravi. But then there's this tendency, Manzoni is very aware of his faults, too, of Borromeo's faults of allowing torture. Oh, yes. And, but he kind of shoves that away, saying
burning witches, witches,
yeah.
Of course.
Saying he was, and Manzoni, of course, was against torture, his relationship to the Verdes also, because of that. But he kind of sweeps it under the rug, saying, well, he was a man of his times, words to that effect,
I think, I agree with you, and I think Borromeo is also functional to the plot. And then, so he needed a powerful and highly educated Fra Cristoforo.
Yeah, and my last question along that line would be, is Manzoni being ironic when he starts talking about all of Borromeo's writings which have been unread?
Well, that's 50-50. It's a debate.
Because so much of his critique is about...
Gadda thought so. Gadda thought, for instance, Gadda's reading is that Manzoni knew that Borromeo's writings were first written not by him.
Yeah.
Everybody knew it already well before the 19th century.
Monti was his
Yeah, they were
ghostwriter.
written by the secretaries, and the assistants. And well, we are in a university. Of course, we all know that there are professors who write articles together with 5 graduate students, and maybe the professor haven't written the article. It's the same thing. But not in the humanities. That's only in the sciences, of course.
Thank you.
And so I haven't thought about it. I tend to trust Gadda's reading of Manzoni, though. So it could be possible that.
One thing that you mentioned, I think in the blurb that you gave us for your talk, is that Manzoni was against mandatory readings in schools.
It's in my talk, but
and a few years later, after his death, he becomes one of the mandatory reading.
Together with Dante, yes, of course.
So what happened there? Why was he against mandatory readings? I have to say that I'm totally in favor of mandatory readings. So
you are in favor?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, here we go.
I think that they can be very harmful for a writer, and they were for Manzoni. But I think that in building an identity, and the fact that you know that all the kids your age are reading the same thing, maybe hating the same thing, has some value.
No, I understand.
But that's my idea. Let's go back to Manzoni.
Let me add that mandatory readings are very good for book sales.
Yes, of course. Well, Manzoni was against, in the debate in the 1860s, he was consulting and a lot with the Ministry of Culture and Ministry for the language, but also for school and so on and so forth. In one of the letters, he says he's not in favor because he's afraid that an author may be involved. Exactly what he was fearing, exactly what he saw had already happened to him. Because, of course, Manzoni knows very well he's a living icon. In 1861, the moment Italy is unified, Manzoni becomes a statue because he's utilized. Verdi wants to see him, Garibaldi wants to go and see him, Victor Emmanuel, Cavour, who goes to see him just a few weeks before he dies. That is obviously signals to him that he has become a statue. No, he's not. And so this is his fear was that people, and the other is that the book would be abused, that is, either for political reasons, or for religious reasons. Il seminario, of course. I doubt that in the seminaries in 1895, or even now, I don't know, but probably now, it's different. But they would explain the passages of the Promessi Sposi the way Flaiano, Gadda, or Calvino read the Promessi Sposi. I doubt it. They probably would say, Don Abbondio is a bad guy. You don't have to do what he does. Look at the others who are good, Fra Cristoforo and Borromeo. That's probably. So this is what we wanted to avoid, this crystallization of a classic, not that he thought he was a classic, but. And the other thing is, it was instead, the reason for which it was inserted, the first time the Regione Lombardia inserted the Promessi Sposi in school is for elementary and junior high school. Of course, what you understand at that age, if you read Promessi Sposi, just the superficial aspect, that is either you laugh or you think, or it's kind of boring in a sense, you don't. And the sentence in Italian says, per edificazione pedagogica. Exactly what he was fearing. Edificazione pedagogica, pedagogical building, pedagogical for teaching good things to students. This is how he entered the school. You see, Leopardi, of course, to make another example, or, I don't know, Il 5 Maggio, to stay with Manzoni or Adelchi, of course, they're not mandatory, but if you teach the 5 Maggio or Adelchi in 1885 in a school in Italy, you don't run the risk of that edificazione pedagogica because of the subject of the poem or of the tragedy that help the author avoiding that issue. But Manzoni knew the Promessi Sposi were already too much seen as a Catholic book only, or as a historical book, or as a risorgimental book only, because he was speaking about Austria rather than Spanish and so on and so forth. And this is not why he wrote the book. So that's why I was against.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes, Professor Forgash.
Thank you, Stefano. It's not really a question, it's a kind of reflection on what you were saying about irony. I mean, I'm a great fan of Manzoni, but I'm kind of politically on the left, and I've often wondered why I like this novel so much. And I think, you know, it's got a lot to do with this sense of ironic distance from the historical process. I mean, I really think in some ways the left can't write a good historical novel because they're too committed to radical change. You know, I'd put Manzoni in the line of Shakespeare, you know, another kind of pro-monarchy, ultimately quite conservative figure, but, you know, brilliant in dissecting how power works in history, power, domination, corruption, all the kind of things that Manzoni exposes are well done. Think of Tommaso di Lampedusa, you know, another conservative, but who writes a wonderful dissection of history. One of the things that came to mind is that when Visconti made his film of Il Gattopardo, he was criticized by his friends on the left for being too close to the novel. He'd kind of replicated that sense of ironic detachment from history. Whereas actually Togliatti said, you know, he did a great job, it's a good film. So, you know, there's a pattern there, I think, about the relationship between irony and this kind of ironic contemplation of how institutions work, how corruption works, that has to be done from a position of political moderation, can't really be done from a position of radicalism. And I'm trying to kind of make sense over the many years I've actually loved this novel, why I like it so much, even though I don't agree with his politics. I've got a little anecdote about this. I did an interview with Cesare Casas once, and he told me a little story about meeting Lukács. And he said, how come in the historical novel, 1936, you say this is, you know, a great, what do you call it, the great epic of the Italian people, and you don't mention that it's a Catholic novel? And Lukács said, I didn't actually notice there was anything about God in this book. So he kind of completely read it as he wanted to read it, as this, you know, kind of almost a sort of Walter Scott, you know, with heroes from the people, you know, the pivot of the stories around these popolani, you know, dissecting all this, and he hadn't actually noticed there's any religion in it. So, you know, there's him saying, I didn't see it was religious. Moravia says it's a piece of Catholic propaganda. I think Lukács kind of got it right, really.
Actually, I understand what you're saying very well, and I agree with what you say. Regardless of, well, Gramsci had already said it. Of course, Gramsci hates Manzoni. It's not that he dislikes it. He hates it because he says Manzoni blocks. He could have done something with this, and so on and so forth. But this is, of course, an ideological approach to reading literature, which I studied in Rome, so I grew up there and studied at the University of Rome, where I do not believe I didn't have a Marxist professors around me when I was a student, so before I came here to the United States. So I don't believe it was impossible nella facoltà di lettere. I mean, maybe there were a couple of democristiani nascosti, that's it, but that was it. So I know very well what you're saying. On the other hand, there is also another problem. There is also, I think it's a matter, I'm sorry again. There is, I shouldn't talk with my hands, I know.
But do.
What is the joke about the British about the Italian? An Italian who's holding two luggages cannot speak because he can't move his hands. But if we envision literature like Lukács, of course, like Gramsci, like you're talking about, as a way to make changes in history, to help making changes in history, definitely Manzoni, from that point of view, either has failed or castrated himself, didn't want to do it, to go ahead. He has, that's why I talk at a certain point about anthropological pessimism. I mean, the choice of fate sometimes seems almost a refuge for somebody who does not believe into the possibility of renewal, of change. He believes in progress. I mean, we discover things, we do new things, fine. And he believes in action, obviously. But he does not believe that at the individual level we can be redeemed, except unless you accept the redemption in terms of the Christian redemption. That's why I mentioned the death of Rousseau, of course, which Foscolo had already, in Italy, Foscolo had already and already basically Jacopo Ortis is Jacopo Rousseau. In a sense, we know that. Leopardi in the Operette Morali or in Zibaldone. There is that impossibility. So he can defend, he doesn't defend, he can place Robespierre in the right historical context in the 1850s when everybody, even DeSantis, was speaking badly about Robespierre. Robespierre was a terrorist, and so, and Manzoni, because of his distance, in a sense, can do that. But he cannot. So I understand. That is the question of why we like or dislike an author. I mean, whether or not we. But my approach, my personal approach to culture, to not just to literature, I mean, art, anything, films, cinema, is try to see what the author wants to do. Whether or not I like it or not, it's a different matter, and I may choose something else. But, and so I believe what Manzoni is trying to do is trying to signify the impossibility, that we are facing an impasse. Life is an exorcism of death. And we don't know it because we exorcise it, push it away. And this is the impasse of life. Therefore, he does not believe. He thinks that the instinct of survival, even if it's against, I mean, there is a wonderful passage about Don Ferrante who quotes Machiavelli. Don Ferrante is quoting Machiavelli without knowing. Don Ferrante doesn't know he's quoting. It's Manzoni is the author that makes him quote. And la morale utilitaristica. Manzoni says very clearly, from a political point of view, Machiavelli gets it, because that's the way the world works. But from an ethical point of view, proves once again that we cannot really change, because the instinct of survival, what we call now the instinct of survival, of course, which wasn't called that way before Darwin, what we call now the instinct of survival pushes us to deny everything which we don't like. Manzoni, one of Manzoni's, this is an important thing probably to understand, in one of Manzoni's beloved book by Pascal, Les Pensées by Pascal, there was a piece of paper that Manzoni, a handwritten piece of paper. This is in the Providence library. I was lucky enough to discover it, but I mean, it was like not an article when I was writing my dissertation in Milan. And this is Aristotle telling us a very important thing, which is the basic of Aristotle's poetry, that is, humans like what they recognize. I mean, in Greek, of course. Humans like what they recognize, which is, of course, the explanation of racism. I don't know you, therefore I don't like you. Get out of my house, get out of my place, you don't belong to my family, my tribe, whatever. But it's also the push towards research, of course, in terms for Aristotle. The more we know, the more we recognize, the less we dislike, right? Manzoni has this, basically, he puts it in Pascal, he puts it there, and this is something that he copied from another book. I don't know from where, frankly. And he put it there. And this is really, I think, explains Manzoni. Humans like what they recognize, and therefore they're not going to learn what they don't know. And I can't. It's not an answer, because I know it wasn't a question, but it's just.
Andrea, following up, and I think it's going to be the last question, and asking you to wear your dean's hat. So men like what they recognize, humans like what they recognize. How do we go about teaching Manzoni today in an American university? How do we make him recognizable to our students? And now, as you were saying in the beginning, the 19th century is the great absent from the curriculum in the Italian 19th century, the great absent from the curriculum of American universities. But now there are all the resources. There is I Canti, as have been
they were
translated.
famous. Manzoni Leopardi, much more than Foscolo. Foscolo dies in England, so everybody thinks Foscolo. Nobody knew Foscolo really in England. Really, wasn't. He was Leopardi. And Manzoni, at the beginning with the 1850s, Arnold, then of course Browning translates Leopardi. But Manzoni was very well known by the intellectuals, by the Longfellow at Harvard. Literal times of places, teaches Leopardi and Manzoni. in 1867. Okay? So in 1867, Leopardi is almost a contemporary, so Manzoni is alive. So the issue was the common people, us, meaning people who were not Longfellow in America or Browning in England. I mean, the people who were not Wordsworth, or they couldn't read Italian. They weren't Mary Shelley, of course. And this is why. How do we do it? Proposing, reading, having a great translation, having finally a translation that can be read, that captures, and making them to read Manzoni, liking or disliking. I mean, of course, this is the way I would do it, showing them how modern it is, how he talks to us, exactly what Ennio Flaiano was telling us. Basically, Manzoni tells us everything that happens. To pick up the example of if you want to put an example, I mean, first a sample, the Conte Zio e Padre Provinciale, you know, when they send Fra Cristoforo to do a bella passeggiata from Pescareni, from Milano to Rimini, che è una bella passeggiata. No, that's the way it ends, the chapter ends with a passeggiata. Well, this is how politics works. Look what's happening now in Italy. I mean, our current prime minister in Italy said that he was going to do, and then she goes to Europe, and of course, troncare. I didn't see it jumping on the neck of Angela Merkel, right? But it was like, oh, carissima. I mean, when I go see the provost, because in my university as a dean, I go there and I have, I'm gonna do, how are you? How is this? Are your children do that? And then at the end, yes, we could do this, we could do that. I worked at the Italian for RAI when I graduated at the University of Rome for a year and a half before I decided I wanted to be an academic. Now I would be one of those guys screaming on TV if I stayed, probably, making much, being famous, of course. And I remember the news. If the Pope and the Prime Minister had insulted each other and told each other terrible things that cannot be repeated, and that the Pope risked to go to hell for say, the news would come out like il Santo Padre e il Primo Ministro si trovano fortemente concordi. And of course we were like, wait a minute, he just said he's a son of blah, 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 and this and that. He doesn't understand anything, but how come? So this is what Manzoni teaches us. Life, compromise, civilization, whatever is civilization, of course, civilization not in the sense of colonialism, but civilization is compromise. Without compromise, we have only wars, right? We see this nowadays, obviously, today. And I think Manzoni, this is his goal. And so you can, I think from this point of view, Manzoni's novel is really modern. Doesn't have the revolutionary, the revolutionary aspect, but it is really modern. It does not believe that the revolution is possible. That's too bad, if you like.
And since it has been evoked and quoted, I just want to remind you that the next step in the Manzoneide Moreide, is going to be the coming Monday. So this is the last event before Thanksgiving. The first event after Thanksgiving, again, Manzoni, and the title is Manzoni, Dostoevsky, and Borges, Lessons to be Learned from the Papal Reading List. And with us, you mentioned the Jesuit. We're going to have a very prominent Jesuit who is the editor-in-chief of Civiltà Cattolica, Padre Spadaro, who's a literary critic. And he's
things have changed about
close collaborator of the Pope. And we're going to talk about, we're going to prendere il toro per le corna. We're going to talk about Manzoni, a Catholic author. Did that help him or not? How was it? And how is it now? So if you're interested, please join us next Monday. And thank you again to Andrea Ciccarelli. We look forward to having you
as a
full-fledged neighbor and colleague in promoting Italian culture here.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you for having me.